2026 playlist for GI, GU, and skull work is on the YouTube page, and I put last year's lectures into it. The sound quality, I mean, it's pretty quiet. I wouldn't use a microphone. I had a problem finding a decent microphone. And so I'll see if I can dig out some previous years and also add those, you know, it's the same content. So it doesn't really matter which one you listen to. If you just have a hard time hearing it, maybe a different year will be helpful. Some of them are during the COVID years, so I got a mask on, so that might not be all that helpful. But anyway, I'll see if I can find those. As I was running through this PowerPoint after class and then, you know, at home, I noticed some things that weren't quite right. So I've done some editing to it, added a little bit of stuff. Some of my math that was in the original version of this PowerPoint was wrong. I was looking at things from an opposite perspective. You know, if you're looking at something that's 30% of something, then you know, the 70% is, you know, the other portion of that equation. And I had 30% in when 70% should have been in there. So I'll point that stuff out if you've been through it. So I know I'm not going to get as many hands as what, you know. Anybody taking a look at the last year's lecture on this? Thank you for your honesty. I got one hand yes and one no, I didn't do anything. So I suspect that, you know, I mean, you get days off from school. I suspect that was the answer for most. So what we're going to do basically is not really start over with this. I'm not going to go all the way back to the brim spectrum. We will talk about the brim spectrum, but I'm not going to draw it out in any of that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of review through the X-ray circuit and talk about the components of the X-ray circuit, and then we'll get into the claims. So what my hope is to get through the first claim, which takes us up through slide number 27. So this is 65-point slide, or 65 slide PowerPoint. So that's going to take us almost halfway through. Not quite, but almost halfway through. Some of the information will kind of lay the foundation for in this class. But let's back up to what the claims were, and then we'll get down and we'll you know, take a look at the circuit and what it is that we do, the hoops we have to jump through to create kVp. All right, so claims about kVp. The change in kVp affects radiographic technique more than any other single factor. We talked a little bit about that. Increase in kVp increases the patient dose, and that is a yes, but with context that we'll talk about. A 15% kVp increase in kVp equals a doubling of the mass, and that's a yes and no. Two things can be true at the same time. Okay, so if we'll talk about that when we get to it. kVp can be used to change image receptor exposure, and that's an absolute yes. Increase in kVp decreases patient dose, which is, you know, seems to be a complete contradiction to point number 2, but it is true. Increase in kVp decreases all interactions, and that might come as a bit of a surprise, but it does. But it comes with a lot of context that we have to add to it. So increase in kVp decreases all interactions. Increase in kVp increases scatter. And that's kind of a sort of. It's, again, seems to be a contradiction considering that scatter creation is one of these interactions, right? So it comes with context. Yes and no is the answer to that as well. Then other imaging considerations: image quality, scattered to the image receptor, and its effect on contrast, noise of all types being scatter, fog, and quantum model, and then high kVp low mass techniques are better for their equipment. So we'll take a look at that. That's all on a single slide. So we went through the definition of voltage and all that last week. We're going to take a look at the circuit, remembering all the stuff that we have to do in order to create kVp. All right, so again, the first thing that the voltage gets to when it enters the imaging system is the line voltage compensation circuit, right? So that's, you know, I like to say it's kind of like a surge protector, but it's really more like a emergency battery backup, because it doesn't just prevent surges, but it also keeps you from having dips in the system as well. It's, you know, in context, probably more important because you've got the heat and the air conditioner that kicks on that kind of sucks some of the power out. And we want to make sure that the kVp, or the voltage specifically, that we send into the auto transformer is consistent. You can turn that down back there if you want to. If you're fanning, you know, you know what I'm feeling like up here. So we want the kVp to be predictable by the time we get it to the auto transformer. And that's the purpose for line compensation. Now you're going to run into questions on tests that ask things like, you know, just that. What makes sure that the voltage is accurate before it gets into the auto transformer? That's line voltage compensation. You may even see questions that ask something to the effect of what is the one control that you don't see on your control panel. Well, the machine takes care of itself. Unless you're working with a single phase machine, line voltage compensation does not appear on your control panel, but it's built into the system and takes care of itself. So the machine, the computer in the machine automatically controls that, so you don't have to adjust it. If you're working with a single phase machine, you'll see that on the control panel. So last semester we went through the auto transformer. With auto transformer, we can increase or decrease voltage, right? And that is really our kilovoltage adjustment. So you'll run into questions that say, where do you adjust your kilovoltage? We don't get kilovoltage until over there, but you adjust it here, right? So you increase or decrease. Works off the transformer law, works off of self-induction. So we supply it with alternating current, creates an alternating or changing magnetic field, so that if we include more turns on the secondary side than the primary side, our voltage goes up. If we have more turns on the primary side than the secondary side, the voltage goes down. What I didn't draw last semester are the difference between these two. Notice how these are more spread out, and we talked about that last week. So each one of these would incorporate more of the secondary side than what these down here do. So these are your major kVp adjustments, minor kVp adjustments. Again, you don't see that on your control panel. You won't see that on your control panel unless you're working with a single phase machine. So major kVp is like 10 kVp, and then minor kVp is maybe 1 per, right? 1 per click. So they got great big knobs, and it goes clack, clack, clack every time you turn them. And you turn the knob that says major kVp, and you're adjusted by about 10 kVp. So to dial it in, you have to use both. So it comes out of there. We've got a kVp meter here, but where is our kVp made?
The secondary side.
Right. So we don't have kVp yet. Why do we call it a kVp meter? More specifically, we call it a pre-reading kVp meter because it's not reading kVp, it's reading voltage in anticipation of it becoming kVp. So what we've got is a situation where if our voltage is correct here, then we know what it's going to be over here, because this is a variable turns ratio. That's a set turns ratio transformer. So we know exactly how much of a boost we're going to have here. So if we have the right voltage here, we can automatically assume it's going to be the right kilovoltage over there. It's a pre-reading kVp meter. Doesn't matter if it's reading voltage. We know how much of a boost it's going to have once we send it through the high voltage transformer. So comes out all that, goes into this, again, fixed turns ratio. And this is a bit deceptive because our turns ratio between primary and secondary side is going to be 500 to 1,000 times, right? So it's going to be a big jump. So, you know, this is basically 2 to 1. It's going to be much more than that. So these little squiggly lines over here should be even squigglier, right? So the remembering back from last semester that all the controls that we can put into the system, we want on the primary side of the high voltage transformer because it works off low voltage and it's safer. The one exception to that is our MA meter. We have to know how much we're actually getting through the circuit, right? So we have to put it on the secondary side, but it's wired into the center of the secondary side where voltage is always at 0. Don't ask me how that works. I don't know. I don't care. Just know that it works. That's all you need to know. So it's wired into the secondary side of the high voltage transformer. So it still works off of low voltage, even though it's on the secondary side of the high voltage transformer, right? So after it comes out of that, we've got to run it through the rectifier. There's always going to be 4 rectifiers. And the purpose for the rectifiers is to turn alternating current. It's already, single phase, or it's already full wave rectified, or 3-phase. This is what turns it into, the full wave rectified, so that the bottom half is flipped over onto the top half. So we want that before the X-ray tube, so that the X-rays go across from cathode to anode, but don't go from anode to cathode and break your filament, right? So that is your main circuit, and then you've got the secondary circuit where we call this a rheostat. A rheostat, if you remember, is anything that you can turn up or turn down. This is also a rheostat, so don't let that throw you if you see a question on a registry that references a rheostat and one of the answers is MA selector. It's also a rheostat. It works a little bit differently than what this one does. This is, specific resistors, and going back to Ohm's law, if you have voltage, you need to change your voltage or your amperage, you can use resistors for that. So it's still going to be relatively, for everyday use, high voltage. We don't want high voltage until we hit it with a kilovoltage, so we're going to send it out of the MA selector into a a step-down transformer. And what that's going to do is it's going to step down our voltage so that we're at, maybe 25 volts. So that once we activate this during the prep stage, all we do is we get a heating of the filament, and we don't send electrons across the tube until we hit the second stage, push the button all the way down, or hit your exposure button, and then the electrons jump across. So as we increase kVp, what we do is we increase the potential energy between the cathode and the anode into the X-ray tube, so that when we hit our exposure button, the higher kVp sends those electrons across the tube faster, carrying more kinetic energy. The more kinetic energy they have, the more energy they have to lose. The more energy they have to lose, the higher the X-ray beam. Remembering how brims are created, they lose energy, slow down, lose energy. The more energy they have, the more energy they lose, and the energy, the X-ray photon that's created, is going to be proportional to how much energy they lose. So you can calculate the energy of an X-ray photon based on how much it lost. So incoming energy, if it comes across the tube with 100 kilovolts worth of energy and it loses 99, then that electron still has 1 kilovolt worth of energy, and what we have then is a 99 kVp X-ray photon, right? So how are you going to get a 99 kVp X-ray photon if you only set 50 kVp? And add 2 words, you, or 1 word, you don't. Right. So that's what controls your brim spectrum. It's also what controls your characteristic spectrum. If you don't have your kVp set to 70 kVp, what are you not going to have?
70 kVp X-ray.
The characteristic X-ray spectrum, right? So it exists right around 70 kVp, it's 69.5. But if you don't set it high enough, you won't have that. Now, do we have other characteristic X-ray photons? The answer is absolutely yes. But the only one that we categorize, the only one that we catalog, is that 69 kVp X-ray photon. So that's the circuit. All right, so now we're going to go way down to claim number 1. kVp has more effect on the X-ray beam than any other factor, and that is absolutely true. So your 4 prime factors are kVp, MA, time, and SID. All right, so walking back through those, we'll go with SID, and we're going to take these for a time individually. Okay, so let's say you're doing a portable X-ray. So with portable X-ray, you're not doing any kind of phototiming. You shoot your X-ray at 40 inches. Right? You go back the next day and the patient is better. You know, you shot portable chest X-ray, the patient was supine, you shot it at 40 inches. You go back the next day, the patient can sit up, so you back up to 72 inches. You use the same technique. What happens? What happens at your image receptor? Use the same technique at 40 inches and 72 inches. What happens at your image receptor? The exposure goes down by a factor of about 3 1/4, 3.24, right? So that's significant, right? So it's significant, but what does it do to the characteristics of the X-ray beam itself? Let's say at emission from the X-ray beam. Nothing. Did nothing, right? It does at the image receptor, but at the tube housing, there's no change, right? So, you know, 2 mass is 2 mass. At the image receptor, there is a significant change. It's not as significant as what, you know, change in kVp would be, but that's SID. So let's say you change your mass, either MA or time, by a factor of 2. So you either increase or decrease one of those factors by a factor of 2. How much of a change in emission do you have? A factor of either one of them individually. It's a factor of 2, right? So it's a direct relationship. Now, how much of a change in kVp do you need in order to affect an equivalent output from your X-ray tube? Well, unless you've been through the PowerPoints, you don't really know. And if you didn't listen to the thing, which again I did the math wrong, you still don't know, right? but if you increase your kVp by 15%, you get about a 70% increase in output from the X-ray tube. Not only that, but that 15% in kVp equates to a doubling at the image receptor. So it's even more significant at the image receptor than what it is coming out of the X-ray tube. Right? So what if you were to double your kVp? That 15% gives you a double. So if you were to double your kVp, in a word, what would you get? A whole lot, right? So even though SID is significant, kVp is much more so. Even though mass, be it MA or time, can give you a significant change, it's got to be a very significant change in order to give you a significant change. With kVp, it doesn't have to be all that significant, right? 15% equals a factor of 2. So it's absolutely true. It increases the area under the spectrum. So this is where last year's became inaccurate. So with the brim spectrum, what we get is, what you notice is that we get a lot of the lower energy X-ray. We get an increase in the lower energy X-rays, but it's not until we get to the upper registry of the lower kVp that we really see the increase in kVp. So what we get is an increase. The area under the bubble represents just numbers, kind of like mass, if you want to draw an analogy there. So we've got a significant change in numbers. We've got a significant change in the peak energy. And then we've also got a push of the height of the bubble, which represents about the third of the peak energy and the average number or average kVp towards a high energy side. So we get a change in all the imaging characteristics. With mass, the bubble goes up. That's it. With SID, the bubble's unaffected unless you increase your mass, right? So kVp is the main thing that's going to control your exposure. So it changes the imaging characteristics of the beam, and what I mean by that is that as you increase your kVp, what does kVp control? What does that control? Quality, beam quality. But in the patient, what does it control? Penetration, right. So if you increase your kVp, you increase quality of the X-ray beam, and we equate kVp to quality because if you shoot with an X-ray beam so low it doesn't penetrate the patient, what good is it for us? What are we trying to do?
Get a good picture.
Penetrate the patient so that we can see the interior contents, what the patient's got in them, and make a diagnosis. So if we don't penetrate the patient, it has no quality, right? So the higher the kVp, the higher the beam quality. Doesn't necessarily equate to image receptor quality or image quality, but it does directly affect the beam quality. All right, so it increases penetrability of the beam. The higher the kVp, the more you can penetrate. Changing the imaging characteristics of the beam. So what a word that we'll use quite a bit is differential absorption. So taking those words and just breaking them apart, what does differential sound like? I'm not talking about on your car, that little pumpkin on the rear end, the trucks that you see. Differential. The first part of that is difference, right? And the second word, absorption, right? So differential absorption. So that's the difference in absorption that you're going to see in different types of tissues. All right, so as kVp goes up, you penetrate more tissues more alike, if that makes sense. So if you could get your kVp high enough, your kVp could potentially get to a point where it doesn't really make that much of a distinction between bone and soft tissue. It penetrates everything at the same rate, or similar enough that you couldn't really tell much of a difference in it. Okay, so differential absorption, it changes the imaging characteristics of the X-ray beam. You lower your kVp, increase differential absorption, increase kVp, reduce differential absorption. So it changes the likelihood if any given photon will penetrate, including scatter radiation, right? So we'll get more into that later on, probably next week. Decreases the chance of photoelectric absorption because you've got more penetration. If it determines if we have a characteristic spectrum, remembering that the characteristic spectrum is what we refer to as discrete spectrum because it only occurs at that 69.5 as opposed to the brim spectrum being continuous, right? And it exponentially increases the number of photons in the remnant beam. I toyed around with this just as kind of word association. I used this for like 2 years and nobody thought it was nearly as witty as I did. But, you go to the grocery store, and this was really prevalent, applicable during COVID. What were we out of at the store? Toilet paper, right. So you buy a pack of toilet paper, and what does it say on toilet paper? 15 rolls equals 40 rolls, right? It's kind of like toilet paper math. 15% change in kVp gives you how much of a change at the image receptor? Factor 2, right? So 15 equals 100%. So it changes everything. All right, so the area under the curve represents tube output. That's the number of X-rays that we create. So it increases all of the numbers at all photon levels, and that's going to be important when we get into patient dose. The entire curve gets higher. That, again, represents our numbers. As kVp is increased, we add more, not just more, but we add higher energy X-ray photons. So, I use this as well. You have, say, 10 tests, and you score consistently. Well, let's make it more significant. You have 3 tests. First test, you make it 80. Second test, you make it 80. Third test, you make 100. What happens to your average? It goes up, right? So it goes up. So we add those high energy photons and we get a higher, or we add those high energy photons, we get a higher average. So the average shifts towards the right. That represents a high energy side. The peak energy is increased. Higher kVp gives us more penetration. Differential absorption decreases, and more tissue types are penetrated at a more similar rate. So this is another thing I did. You know, sometimes the publisher will change, you know, editions, and they have to every 5 years. That's because we have to adopt new books every 5 years. It's an accreditation thing. And sometimes nothing changes in the book except for maybe they take the chapters and they, you know, staple all the pages together, take the book, they throw it up in the air, and it comes back down, it hits the ground, and all the chapters are just shuffled around. So the page numbers on the video that's in Canvas right now are from the last edition. So I went through, I tried to catch everywhere that the page number changed. So on page 139 and 140, kVp in the Brim spectrum, as kVp is increased, the area under the curve increases to an area close to the square of the amount of the change. So what that means is that as we increase from 72 to 82 kVp, that's 15% change, what we get is a change that is approximately square the change in that difference. All right. So let me find the diagram that describes that. So not that one. I'm not real. I don't know, I'll run into it here in a bit. But basically, on page is, okay, so see the problem on page 140. All right, let's run through it. So as the kVp increases, the area under the curve increases to an area close to the square of the amount of change. The relative distribution shifts to the high energy side. We talked about that. The area under the curve has approximately doubled. That's the area under the curve. But what you get is an exponential increase, or no, that is not. All right, let me get to the other PowerPoint. There we go. There we go. So again, my problem was I was looking at the percentage completely backwards. So the change, mathematically, the change is about 70%. So you increase your kVp by 15%, then what you get is emission from the X-ray tube that's pretty much close. This is emission from the tube, 70%. Okay, so you increase your output by about 70%. How that breaks down is here, and you know you take the 1 off. The 1 is the whole number, you know, and 7.04% is what you have there, or 70.4%. Okay, but 70% does not equal 100%, right? They're not the same. 100% means, you know, if you have 100% of something, you've got all of it. Right? 70% is less than that. 70% is 7/10. So the mathematical equation on 140 partially explains the rule of thumb. It states a 15% increase in kVp is equivalent to doubling the mass. And the answer to that is yes and no. It doesn't equate to doubling the exposure from the image receptor. So if you look in the next paragraph, a 15% increase in kVp doesn't double the X-ray intensity at the image or at the X-ray tube, but is equivalent to doubling the mass at the image receptor. Why? What changed as you increase your kVp by 15%? You got a 70% increase from the tube, but what imaging characteristic changed? you increase penetration. So even though you only increased from the tube 70%, more of those X-ray photons are likely to penetrate the patient, and what that gives you is a doubling at the image receptor. Okay? So more toilet paper math. All right, so a 15% increase in kVp does not double the X-ray intensity at the X-ray tube, but it is equivalent to doubling the mass at the image receptor, because with increased kVp you get more penetration and more exposure on the image receptor. So doubling the output from the tube would require kVp of about 40%. That was straight out of Bushong. I did not do the math on that. We're just going to take his word for it. It seems a little high to me, considering that 70% is what we got out of 15%. That seems like 40% increase in kVp would be more than that. So if that smells a little off to you, it does to me as well. So kVp and X-ray intensity. Intensity, just meaning the number of X-rays equivalent to mass, varies very rapidly with kVp. If kVp were doubled, then if kVp were doubled, intensity would increase by a factor of 4. So it's exponential change, right? Theoretically, doubling the intensity by kVp manipulation alone requires an increase of 40%. As kVp increases, the penetrability of the X-ray beam is increased, and relatively fewer X-rays are absorbed by the patient. So again, even if we doubled our kVp, then the result on the image receptor would be even more significant than doubling, right? So if you went from 50 kVp to 100 kVp, that's a doubling in your kVp, right? But the result on the image receptor would be exponentially higher than that. It wouldn't be, doubling. It would be a factor of 4 greater than that possibly. So it's relatively, it's a big word in this, is relatively. So is the wording confusing? Yeah, it is. But if you look on page 144 and 145, it kind of helps a little bit. So the context there is the first sentence on the page seems to suggest 15% change doubles the output from the X-ray tube, but it does not. That's a 70% increase. But it does double at the image receptor because you get that increased penetration. So the penetrability of the X-ray beam is increased and less radiation is absorbed inside of the patient, leaving proportionally greater number at the image receptor. So, what's the context of that? Increase in kVp alone does not categorically lessen the amount of radiation absorbed by the patient. But we just said as we increase kVp, we increase penetration, right? So how is it that increasing kVp alone doesn't decrease penetration, or doesn't decrease patient dose? Patient dose as being absorbed by the patient. Well, if you look at this, as we increase kVp, where did we get an increase in numbers? It's just in a word. Everywhere. Yeah. Everywhere, right? So this is 25 kVp. When's the last time you set a technique for 25 kVp? Never. Right. So if you set a technique for 25 kVp, what would be your average energy? A third of that, roughly 8. Thank you. Thank you. 8. So we're down into here. Okay, so what are you going to penetrate with 8 kVp? Not much anything. Thinnest of soft tissues, right? Did you get more 8 kVp X-ray photons?
With an increase?
With an increase, yes. Yeah, when you increased from 72 to 82.
Yes.
Then yes. So are those 8 kVp X-ray photons more likely to penetrate than these 8 kVp X-ray photons? No. No. Absolutely not. Right? So if we could say that, we'll just, I don't know, I wish we had more numbers on here. Let's say in this, oversimplified explanation, let's say 20 kVp, all of the 20 kVp and below absorb into the patient. 20 kVp. What happens to the patient dose? Goes up, right? So let's say from 20 to 40, about half of them, what happens to patient dose? Goes up. And let's say above 40, everything penetrates, right? So what we get is more penetration, absolutely true, but we also get more exposure to the patient. If the only thing that we do is increase kVp, what happens to patient dose? Goes up, right? So when you're reading your test questions, don't read too much into your test question. I know that's kind of hard to do because write the tests. But if it just says you increase your kVp, what happens to patient dose? Your answer is it increases. It increases. Right. It's going to increase. Is it going to increase by that 70%? The answer is no. Why? Because above 40 kVp, what happened? Everything penetrated. Right. Right. So when we have penetration, we've got essentially 4 interactions. One's not really an interaction, but one's photoelectric. What happens to your dose with photoelectric? One X-ray photon totally absorbs inside of the patient. It dumps all of its energy in the patient, total dose, right? So what happens with scatter? Scatter is partial absorption, right? So you still get some dose. But what happens to the dose with penetration with no interaction?
No absorption.
Nothing, right? It just goes to the patient, right? So the higher the kVp, the more penetration you're going to have on this end, but the more absorption you're going to have down here, right? So with just an increase in kVp, your dose is going to go up by 70%? No. But is it going to go up? The answer is yeah. All right, so just kind of drawing the comparison between kVp and mass. You increase your kVp by 15%, you get 100% increase at the image receptor, right? And your dose goes up by something. I don't know how much. It goes up by something. We're going to use that 70%, but it doesn't really. All right, we're going to use that just for simplicity's sake. It goes up. How much of a change in mass do you have to have a doubling at the image receptor? Factor of 2, right? Now how much did your patient dose go up? And changes imaging characteristics of the X-ray beam. So how much did it go up? Also by a factor of 2, right? So when we're talking about changes in kVp versus mass, which technical factor gives us less dose? kVp, right? All right, so increasing kVp alone does not categorically lessen the amount of radiation absorbed by the patient. The low energy, high absorbing photons are still going to be absorbed. Those minimum energies are going to be absorbed. Some are going to get through. And the higher energy photons, okay, they're going to scatter as well, but they have a greater chance of penetrating without any kind of interaction, plus they have the potential for the scatter to exit the patient. And that becomes important later on too. So what does it mean? Multiple things can be true at the same time. 2 things can be true simultaneously. So as kVp goes up, the new added high energy photons and the higher energy photons that previously existed will be more likely to penetrate to the patient. So as less radiation absorbed by the patient, leaving the patient proportionally greater? Yeah. And the chances of, as you increase your kVp, the chances of having more penetrate through the patient increases, but you also increase patient dose. Okay, so image receptor exposure goes up, but so does patient dose. The only thing that you change is kVp. It's going to go up. So all the ones that didn't penetrate before, you just get more of those, and they also don't penetrate the patient, so the patient dose does go up. All right, so just, simple numbers, really. So we're taking the X-ray beams that they had in their brim spectrum, 72 kVp and 82 kVp. So we get 70% increase from the tube output, let's say with our hypothetical 72 kVp X-ray beam, and you know that you don't create 100 photons with, any X-ray beam. You create a whole lot more than that. So we're going to say we've got 90 photons. So 30 of those absorb, 30 of those scattered, and 30 of those penetrate. So exactly 1/3 of each one, right? So as we increase to 82 kVp, what we got was what we get is a increase in absorption, right? So patient dose goes up. We had 30 before, now we've got 46. So the only thing that would change was kVp. We increased kVp. Already we're seeing what happened to patient dose.
Increase.
It increased, right. So scatter, that's total absorption. That's the photon loses all of its energy. So scatter is partial absorption. We had 30 before, now we've got 47. What happened to scatter? It increased, right? So we had 30 before, and I'm sorry, we had 30 before, and we've got 47 now. You're getting a little bit ahead of me. I'm going to back up and I'm going to go through percentage. And then we went from 30 penetrated to 60 penetrated. So now we've got a doubling at the image receptor. But if you look at the percentages, what happened? Well, we had a 33% absorption rate, but what is it after we increased our kVp? 30%. So it went down. Right. So we had 33% before at 72, and we've got 30.7 at 82. What happened to our percentage? It went down. Right. So then we had 30 and we had 60. So more of our beam in this hypothetical situation penetrated through the patient. So what we can get from this is that we can have two things exist at the same time. Did dose go up when we increased kVp? Yeah. But what was one of our claims? As kVp goes up, all interactions go down. They go down. Okay, so that's percentage-wise. Number-wise, if the only thing that we change is kVp, number-wise, we get an increase in numbers, we get an increase in dose, even though the percentage goes down. Okay?
Yeah, because if the percentage remained the same, it would be much greater.
Exactly.
Increase.
Exactly. There will be effectively no difference between changing kVp and max, right? Neither one would be a safer dose. So we're going to talk more about those here in a bit. And so this is just kind of the summary of that. At 72 kVp, there was equal distribution. At 82 kVp, more of the being transmitted, and I missed that in adjustment of the numbers. That should have been higher than that, I believe. And absorption went up. So we do get an increase in penetration, but we also get an increase in absorption as well. All right. We started at 9:15 and we're at 10:04, so pretty much right on time. Any questions? We're going to dip back into this, throughout the next 2 days that we talk about kVp. kVp is crazy complicated, right? So we're going to kind of dip back into this because once we get into the 15% rule and adjustment of mass and better techniques for your patients and even historical context for how it is that we utilize kVp and mass now as opposed to when we were using screens and films, it's applicable. Any questions?
So when you increase kVp by 15%, the tube output is increased by 70%?
Correct.
And the IR exposure is doubled?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Now, of those things, and the reason I'm kind of bringing all that up is just for full understanding. chances are, when you get to the registry, it's just gonna ask you about image receptor exposure. If it asks anything about patient exposure, it will be in context of what Amy will talk about this semester. Okay. So the test question answer is 15% increase in kVp is going to give you
70%.
how at the hour is going to be a doubling of exposure. If we're talking about patient exposure, I'm not going to nail it down to specifically how much patient exposure is going to be. It's just going to be that patient exposure, if kVp is the only thing that you change, you increase your kVp, then patient exposure is going to go up. Yeah. It's just going to be directional. All right? We'll pick up there on Wednesday. Yeah.